Hello everyone, welcome to another video. So today let's look into what is an abstract factory method. Before we get into the video, let's look at a problem statement. So right now the problem statement mentions that we need to create an authentication functionality based on OAuth protocol, and there are two requirements for this. First is that it should have an authentication function, and it should also support the authenticate with Google functionality. So let's quickly implement that. So let's create a new folder, or rather let's go into this and let's just add a new class and let's just call it authentication. Alright, so and let's hop over that class. Okay, so as the requirement says that you need to have an authentication function, and also it should support Google authentication. So for the sake of this tutorial, we will not be diving into how we can actually implement the OAuth 2.0 protocol, but we'll just create method stubs wherein it just returns a Boolean value indicating if the authentication was successful. Let's quickly create a class, and let's call it authentication via authentication. Let's call it authentication functionality. Right, and per the requirement we need to have an authentication function, and it should return a boolean if that specific authentication was successful. So let's create a public method which returns a boolean, and let's just check authenticated, and let's say that the magic happens here. And by magic what I mean is that the redirect to Google server, and uh, the actual page where the user authenticates, the code block for that happens here. And like I mentioned earlier, for the sake of this tutorial we will not be going into that. And let's just okay, let's just return true. Let's just return true, meaning that the authentication happened successfully, right? The callee here would need to create an object for this specific. You need to create an object for this class, and after creating an object he would need to call this method, and this method would actually give us a status indicating whether the user has authenticated. Now all looks fine, but there is actually one problem with this specific approach. Let's go back to the slide and see what happens. Okay, so here we are at the original problem statement which we got. It should have an authentication function. Yes, done. We have that method in the class. And the second statement says that it should support Google authentication. Yes, we also have that. And all works fine. But what happens if a new request comes in? And let's say that the product evolved and we wanted to add support for Microsoft. And you see where this goes, right? We eventually get a new request. Now today it's Google and Microsoft, and then later you'll have login with Twitter, login with GitHub, login with Facebook. All these functionalities can actually come in. So for this request, that is add support for Microsoft, let's quickly go back and implement that feature, or extend our class to support this specific feature. So I'm back in my class. Now let's say that now there are two things here. I need to identify what is actually the type of authentication that is being called. So let's create a string variable and call it provider. And this is actually going to determine if this specific authentication needs to call Google or Facebook or Microsoft. Now we actually need to create an additional method. Let's say that authenticate with Google, and let's say that it defaults to true, and this also defaults to true. Alright, so and we need to have a conditional check here. If the provider being called is for Google, then we need to return the authentication with Google function. Else, if the provider here is of a type Microsoft, then we need to call the authentication with the Microsoft functionality. Alright, so this works. Now we need to quickly remove this specific line because we don't need that. And now this works. Now what happens here is that there are two things that are going wrong. One is that every time we need to implement a new feature, or every time we need to add an authentication provider, we would need to come back to the specific class and then we would need to extend it. Now what goes wrong here? We are basically breaking the second rule from the solid principle, which is open closed. So every time a new feature is added, we have to come back to the original class and modify it. And then since this specific method is being modified, we would need to test all the functionality which we implemented it, right? So this is a use case where the factory design pattern can be used. So let's quickly refactor this method and use factory design pattern, and let's see how it works. Okay, let's go to the creational design folder, then add a new class, and let's just call it let's do it this way. So we need to rebuild the authentication system using the factory design pattern. So the first thing what we need to do is we need to analyze the requirement which was given to us. So to summarize, the requirement has one main feature or one main function, which is authenticate. And that authenticate should either be via Google or via Facebook or via GitHub or via Amazon or any external authentication providers. So let's quickly create an interface which has a single method, and let's just call it authenticate. Okay, so I have an interface and I call it iAuthenticateCS. Now keep in mind we can also create an abstract class. So the use case between an interface and an abstract class varies depending on what functionality or how you are going to use it. So for this tutorial, let's stick to the authentication or iAuthenticateCS interface. So so this is an interface, and this has a single method, and it should have, and let's just also, okay, so this should be fine. And we have created an interface, and we have called that interface iAuthenticateCS, and it has a single method, and that method is the authenticate method, and the return type of that method is a boolean. Now this is going to act as a base class for all the implementation which we require. Now let's quickly re-implement the first feature, and we would need to create a class, and let's call that class as Google Authenticate. Alright, so we are in Google Authenticate right now, and the first thing we need to do is we need to implement that specific interface, and let's quickly do that. So we have this, okay, and we would need to implement the authenticate method. And it should be public. Okay, so we have our first class, which is Google Authenticate, which inherits from the interface which we created. And again, for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just stick to the default return, which is just going to return true, meaning that every time we call the authenticate method, we are making an assumption here that we are always going to say that the user has successfully authenticated, right? So this is the Google Authenticate right now, and let's also implement the second feature request that came in, which was to have functionality for Microsoft Authentication. So let's create another class. Let's call it Microsoft Authentication.cs. So this is the other class which we created, and let's do the same exercise, that is create a class. And let's inherit from the iAuthenticate now again this would have the method which is required to be implemented. That's the authenticate method, and again let's just default to true, right? Okay, so yeah, it should be iAuthenticate, I guess. Yep. So if you see, let's quickly summarize. So we have basically an interface which is called as iAuthenticate, and that has a single method which is going to have the authenticate functionality. And we are going to add multiple classes where each class only holds logic specific to that authentication. So we have segregated the authentication into different files. So there is the Google Authenticate, which is going to hold all the logic related to Google Authentication, and then we have the Microsoft Authentication class, which is going to hold all the authentication related to Microsoft. Now, uh, the big question, how are we going to tie up all this functionality? For that, let's create another class, and let's call it the authentication provider. And let's call it authentication provider CS. Okay, so we would actually need we would actually need a function wherein it is going to return the right instance of the type of authentication which the callee requires. So let's do the exercise of creating a class first. Authentication provider, and let's say that this is actually going to return a type which is of any authentication that we require. So let me just go back to the screen. So what we need to do with this class is that this class should have a function that is going to return the type of authentication that we require. So we have Google Authentication, we have Microsoft Authentication, and in future there could come in authentication supporting Facebook, Amazon, GitHub, right? So we need to have a type for that. So if you have already noticed, all these authentication classes are inheriting from the iAuthenticate interface. which means the Google authentication derives from this, and even the Microsoft authentication derives from this as well. So what we can do is, so we need to have a method, and that method is actually going to return a type of the authentication, which is the interface that we created. Correct. So this is I authenticate interface, and let's just get have a function get authentication provider, right? And we would also need to have some sort of identifier to identify what is the callee required. So let's again stick to string. Ideally in production, or ideally if you want to maintain the code better, this could be an enum, which is having multiple enum types, which are either Google or Microsoft or Facebook. But for this tutorial, let's just stick to basic string. Let's call it provider. Okay, so in this instance, what we need to do is, if the provider is equal to Microsoft, then we actually need to return a new instance of the Google Authenticate function. Else, if string let's okay, I made a mistake here. So this should not be Microsoft, this should be Google, because that is what we are trying to return there. Right? So if it is let's return Microsoft authentication. So we don't need this curly braces, because this is a single line if else block. So we have this method here, and it is the get authentication provider method, and this is actually going to check the provider type, and based on the provider string, we are going to either return a Google Authenticate or the Microsoft Authentication provider. So the reason why there was the compiler was complaining about the return type of the Google Authenticate is because I made a mistake in implementing this, and instead of having the I authenticate interface, it was pointing to something else. So got that fixed, and let's get back to this method. Yeah, so and if this method should return any authentication. If you see this method, it is still complaining because we are not having a default return type. If these two conditions fail, we should return something, and what we can actually do is check the provider string, and if it does not match to either of the functionality that we have implemented, what we can easily do is that we can throw a new not implemented exception. And this is actually a wrong, this is not a clean code. We are just doing this for the sake of this tutorial. And let's just say that the provider is not implemented. So since it's a string, we also need to have a check here to check if that string is valid. And let's just check the provider, and if it is null, then ideally we should be throwing an argument null exception. and let's pass in a message. Provider cannot be null or empty. Right, so this looks good. So let's summarize. So any callee or any class which requires some sort of authentication, all they need to do is create an instance all they need to do is create an instance of this authentication provider class and call the get authentication provider and pass in the provider that they require. And based on the provider that the callee pass, it would either be a Google authentication or it is going to be a Microsoft authentication. Now, how have we improved this code base? Let's say that the requirement got changed again and we are required to add one more authentication. Let's call it Facebook. So what we need to do is we don't need to modify any class. We just need to extend, and all the functionality associated with each specific authentication remains isolated to their own class. So in future, let's say that we got another requirement and the other requirement was to have another authentication, and let's call it Amazon, and then we just need to return a new type of that Amazon authentication, and for that we would need to create or implement the iAuthenticate interface and create a new class. So this is a practical example of how a factory pattern could be designed or used. So some pro tips here. We can also modify the class in such a way that we don't require the string provider. So what we can do is we can come back to this interface and then add a string property here, and that string property we can actually name it and call it the provider, and every class that implements that specific string property needs to specify the type of provider that they are implementing. And then when we come back to this class, the authentication provider class, we can also inject the instances, and .NET Core supports the singleton DI as part of the service provider. We can actually inject it and then use the get service provider base and get the correct provider that we would need. So those are code improvements, but the underlying principle or the underlying class structure remains the same. Hope this helps, and thank you.